Greetings and welcome back to Doctor Who Revisited, my ongoing series where I go through every single episode of Doctor Who from 1963 all the way up to 2022 and review them. And this is it. This is the big one. This is the one I knew we were going to get to eventually. The 10th Planet. William Hartnell's final episode as the Doctor, officially. Not William Hartnell's final appearance on Doctor Who, and certainly not the last appearance of the first Doctor, but this is officially William Hartnell's final story as the Doctor. First of all, positives, at least not all of the episode is missing, right? But yeah, unfortunately, the last part of the serial is the only episode that is somehow missing. I don't know if it was a case of just the BBC threw out the entire episode and they only found the first 3 parts of it and somehow couldn't find the last episode, or if they just threw out the last episode, which is even dumber. Okay, so I get the appeal of throwing away some episodes like The Smugglers or The Massacre or some of these other episodes that, you know, didn't really had anything interesting about them. But this is the introduction of the Cybermen, of all things. And even more so, it's William Hartnell's final episode as the Doctor. Why on earth would you throw that away? Seriously, BBC, what is wrong with you? Like, the idiocy of throwing all these episodes away, it's the mistake that keeps on taking. I can't say it's the gift that keeps on giving, but I don't really know the opposite of that. So it's like, it's the mistake that we keep paying for. And the worst part about it is, normally, when you make a mistake, you're the one paying for it. When the BBC made that mistake of throwing all these episodes away, the fans are the one paying for it. In more ways than one. But you know what? I gotta move on, otherwise I'll be hung up on this tangent for too long. First of all, really liked the episode. This is another thing that I liked about the 60s era of Doctor Who, where the final part of each serial sort of led into the next one. So it sort of gave us a hint as to what the next episode is going to look like before the next serial starts. That's something that happens in this season in particular a lot, and we're going to see that quite often. But yes, setting it in the North Pole, definitely an area that Doctor Who is going to revisit eventually at some point. Spoilers. Setting it in the North Pole in the near future of 1986, making it more about the space race without actually acknowledging the space race. And quick reminder, this is 1966, where the episode broadcast. The moon landing hadn't happened yet. Obviously, the space race was at its highest. I mean, they've already had Laika and Yuri Gagarin, and first animal in space, first man in space, first woman in space, all of that. But the Neil Armstrong moon landing hasn't happened yet. So this was still very, very topical to when they made this episode, and it's a good prediction, I would say. It's a good way of predicting the near future of how space travel would look like 20 years from now. Not 20 years from now, 20 years from 1966, which would put this at 1986. And I like that. As much as Doctor Who sometimes used to make these outlandish predictions about the future, particularly in the Patrick Troughton era, in this episode they didn't really go too outlandish with it. Like, they predicted a much more unified Earth, much more unified space race, I should say, where they didn't necessarily call it the United Nations, but there is some sort of a unified, and again, they don't really call it NASA. I can't remember what they actually call it in the episode, but there's like this conglomeration of representatives from different countries who all strive for an equal goal, the development of space travel, which is good. I mean, it's good that they were trying to predict much more peaceful Earth, much more peace in our time Earth, 20 years from when the episode was being made. And I like that. And I like that they also addressed the idea that space travel is a lot easier now because computers are much more advanced and it requires less manpower to do these things. Little did they know that after the moon landing, people would mostly just lose interest for a couple of decades in space travel. There still was space travel from 1969 all the way up till now, but it's just, it wasn't a priority anymore. The space race was kind of over after the moon landing, after the United States declared a decisive victory or whatever they wanted to the propaganda to be, because that really was what was the space race all about. It's just who can get to the moon first. But yeah, it's nice that they would at least consider the idea that once the moon landing has already happened, space travel, that the Earth was going to continue to prioritize space travel as much as they did back in the 60s. Again, little did they know that that wasn't the case anymore, but it's a nice prediction of the future, that more people from all over the world would put space travel in really high regard. And here's another thing that I think gets a little overshadowed in this episode, is that at the very beginning of the story, we see this team of astronauts doing a sort of routine loop around space, and the commander of the flight, the captain of the flight, is a person of color. There's a black astronaut. Like, they predicted black astronauts, like, before the moon landing, which is great. I like that this was the progressive way of thinking with Doctor Who back in the 1960s. Now, obviously, classic Doctor Who is pretty notorious for a lot of unintentional racism, I would say. I don't think they meant the Celestial Toymaker to look the way that he did. I don't think they intended Marvick Chen to look as racist as he did. Like I said, it's a lot of I would say unintentional racism at the time. But, I mean, that's how they operated back in the 60s. So I like that, at least for William Hartnell's final episode, they had a black person in space. Like, they allowed themselves to think progressively in that way. And not only that, there was an Italian soldier in that base. So, and I think there was a Latino president, or I don't know if president's the right word, but like the head of the space program, the head of the UN, or rather the equivalent of the UN, and like many people from many different countries got prominent roles in this international space thing. But yeah, so they were thinking that at least the 80s will be a bit more progressive, which in a way they kind of were, but it's nice that they were at least considering it in Doctor Who. And remember, this is around the same time that the original Star Trek series started, which did put people of color and people of different nationalities, all kinds of nationalities, in the forefront of their storytelling. They really did put an emphasis on how anyone can be an astronaut, anyone can go to space. And remember, that original Star Trek was set hundreds of years in the future, where hopefully humanity is a bit more progressive with their thinking. So I think this episode definitely benefited a lot from the original run of Star Trek that was happening around the same time. And this episode, in many ways, is just it's a treasure trove of geek stuff, because not only is it the episode that introduces regeneration, it's also the episode that introduces the Cybermen into the universe, which later, speaking of Star Trek, several years later, that becomes the inspiration for the Borg. And also, the spacesuit that was used in this episode later became the main costume for Bosk, the Trandoshan bounty hunter from Star Wars. So, like I said, this episode just is a milestone of geek goodness. Like, it's a smorgasbord of different things, not just for Doctor Who, but for Star Trek as well, and Star Wars, and many other things from around that same time. So, there's a lot of good stuff that came out of this episode, and I've only just talked about, I spent like 10 minutes talking about, like, technical stuff about it. The actual meat and bones of the episode comes in the performances. The performances were great, really likable characters, and really characters with understandable motives. You understand that American general and his concern that gets, and how his descent into madness with each passing moment of the episodes kind of comes into play. You kind of feel for him when he has that phone call with the guy in charge of everything, tells him that his son is on the next flight into space to figure out what's happening. And you see, again, it's the acting. You see the look on his face when he hears that his son's life could be in danger, and how he just completely goes off the wall crazy trying to get his son back in one piece. And then obviously there's the Cybermen themselves. I like the design. I like the original design of the Mondasian Cybermen. A design so iconic, Stephen Moffat just couldn't help himself and brought it back in Capaldi's penultimate story. But yeah, that's how good the design was. Now, obviously, this is the one and only, this originally was the one and only time we were ever going to see that particular design of the Cybermen, until, they brought it back years later, and, whatever. That's the thing. But when the Cybermen showed up in their next appearance, almost a completely different design for them. But I felt like that design was pretty perfect. They didn't really need tampering with, and I liked the way that they looked. Obviously, it's a very, very early stage beta, I should say, look of how we know the Cybermen to look like these days. But I think as a design, it captures what the Cybermen are meant to represent pretty perfectly. And I'll tell you something else. I love the voices. I love the Cybermen voices, and the way they did the voice, where they just open up their mouths as wide as possible, and you just hear the voice of, I can't remember if it was Roy Skelton or Peter Hawkins at the time, but you just hear the voice coming from off set, while the guy was just standing there going. And also, I love that they just cock their head every time they start speaking. Really no point and reason for doing that, but it's fun. I know it's cheesy and goofy and 60s. I like it. What can I say? I liked how the Cybermen operated in that time. And yeah, the Cybermen, while they did look, I guess that by today's standards, they look incredibly goofy. One can only imagine how they look like to people who were introduced to them for the first time in the 60s. Like, when you first see these silvery men walking around lumbering from their spaceship, kill the people with one strike, and then just see the ending of the first episode, focusing on their face, on one of the Cybermen's face, and that's the cliffhanger. And so you get these 4 Cybermen basically terrorizing everybody, pretty much invulnerable to bullets, and they just have this machine in their stomach, torso area that can fry people to death. And then obviously they take care of them. They get rid of all 4 of them, or 5, I can't remember. And then there's another cliffhanger of the guy looking at the screen, is like, Cybermen, hundreds of them, or thousands, I can't remember. And it's like, they barely took care of 4 Cybermen now. Now they've got hundreds, maybe thousands of Cybermen coming. And yeah, great crisis. I keep saying this word a lot when it comes to these early Doctor Who episodes. It's a great conflict, great crisis. It almost, in a way, feels like a season finale. And that's only episode 2 of the season. Well, serial number 2. But I mean, it is a regeneration episode. So naturally, the stakes are much higher than a normal episode. I would even go so far as to say that the stakes in this episode are even higher than the War Machines. Because if you remember, in the War Machines episode, the War Machines were mainly localized to the city of London. This episode, Cybermen are sporadically landing all over the Earth. We don't necessarily see that, but we hear it on the monitors, and I think we do see Cybermen in that international space place with all the people from different nationalities. And obviously they all die out when Planet Mondas sort of gets destroyed. But I suppose now this is a really good segue into my next point. The Doctor, kind of pointless in this episode. And now I get it. A lot of people are talking to me about how in a lot of Jodie Whittaker's episodes she didn't really do much. Like, she didn't solve the problem. She didn't have much to do. And I've got this really good friend of mine who keeps saying that there wasn't much of Jodie Whittaker in Jodie Whittaker's final episode. Look at this episode as the example. Like, seriously, what does the Doctor do in this episode? Other than, pass out most of the time. Now, again, I get it. William Hartnell's health situation was getting worse and worse by the day. Hence, they replaced him at the end of this episode. I get it. And they needed an excuse for William Hartnell to take longer breaks. Hence, they came up with him passing out multiple times during this episode. Little did we know at the time that this was all foreshadowing his incoming regeneration. Like, after aging 100 years in the Dalek Master Plan and having some of his life force taken away from him in the Savages, this old body of his was wearing a bit thin, as he even mentioned in the episode. So that's why he kept going in and out of consciousness, and he was really, really weak all throughout this episode. But even he said it himself before any of that started. He told the people, the humans on that North Pole base, to just not do anything. Don't help the Cybermen. Just keep stalling, playing for time. Mondas is going to get destroyed eventually anyway. And with it, the Cybermen are going to die out as well. So he pretty much already solved the problem before there was a problem to solve. And just no one listened to him because, humans. What do we know? But the lack of William Hartnell in this episode gave more for Ben and Polly to do. And I like the dynamic that they're going to continue doing during the Patrick Troughton era with Polly. Because remember, Polly is a secretary character. That's how she was introduced in the War Machines. And they're going to have several different storylines, including this one, where she offers to just, be a secretary, making coffee to people. And while you could argue that it's objectifying her as a stereotypical woman of the 60s, the subtext of that is that while she's making coffee for all the men who are doing all the work, she, in the meantime, gets to know these people better. And look at what she does in this episode in particular. She, I suppose, making the coffee is sort of a vehicle for letting her get closer to these people and know exactly what's happening, and in a way execute the Doctor's plan while Ben is off doing something else. And I liked how they used Ben in this episode, escaping from through the ventilation shaft. It's not really a Doctor Who episode if someone doesn't try to escape through a ventilation shaft. Obviously. Yeah, I love how they split the workload between Polly and Ben while William Hartnell was taking a nap. I think that's good writing, especially when you have two companions who are kind of a package deal, like Ian and Barbara were at the time. So I like that they gave each of them something to do. Other than that, I think I pretty much touched on all the major points that I wanted to touch on. Not necessarily in the right order, but at least I did get there in the end. But I like that they introduced the idea that these Cybermen are allergic to radiation, and that's a good way of defeating the Cybermen this early in their run. Obviously, this was before they introduced the idea of the Cybermen being allergic to gold and whatnot. But yeah, it's a good way of deterrent for the Cybermen in this story. But I think that's really all I could say. And now we gotta talk about the regeneration scene. Obviously, again, final episode is missing. Why? I will never understand. But as far a regeneration scene, remember, this is the first. They had no idea what they were doing with this concept at the time. They just needed an easy way out for the actor and bring in a new actor. And the regeneration effect with the lighting and the overexposure, that came about kind of by accident. They didn't mean to do it. It's just, it's a happy accident, which happens a lot in sci-fi, and in Doctor Who is no exception to that. The Doctor feeling worse and worse as the episode goes on, and then just, entering the TARDIS. Now, obviously, thanks to Stephen Moffat, we do know that some stuff happened in between this episode and the regeneration scene. Like, from him exiting the Cyberman ship and entering the TARDIS, a lot has happened in between, apparently. But the regeneration scene itself, again, most of it is still missing, but a lot of it still somehow miraculously survived. I don't know who had the intellectual foresight to know that the BBC would be stupid and throw that episode away. But thankfully, that the whole regeneration scene survived, of the Doctor opening the doors of the TARDIS, potentially seeing his future incarnation in the 11th Doctor, because Mark Gatiss says so. But yeah, all the instruments of the TARDIS flickering all at once, and this kind of set a precedent for the Doctor in a way, of just regenerating inside the TARDIS. And because everything in the TARDIS was going haywire while he was regenerating, this also sets a precedent for the special bond that the Doctor has with his TARDIS. In a way, it's like the TARDIS is sort of reacting to her Doctor changing. And again, this is, I think, years and years before they even started to explore the concept of the TARDIS being sentient, of being an actual sentient living being. So it's a smorgasbord of geek stuff that came out later in life. Of like, you can look back at this episode and point to, this is where that came from. But because they set that TARDIS council in motion the way that they did, you could have idiots like me saying stuff like this, that the TARDIS is reacting to the Doctor regenerating, even though that wasn't really the intention at the time. So, yeah, the regeneration scene, while it's not the best, clearly, because it was the first, and they didn't really have an understanding of what they were going to do with this concept in years to come, the fact that it is the first just, sets the precedent for what regeneration scenes are going to look like, not what regeneration scenes should look like in the future. And, yeah, that's really it. And, can't wait to talk about the Patrick Troughton era next, but, that is a story for another time. So I think I've talked more than enough about this episode. This might be my longest review yet of this series. And I'm happy, because, it's William Hartnell's final. It's a massive episode, even though not by today's standard, but a lot has happened in this episode. And like I keep saying, this episode sort of introduced a lot of things that would later be expanded upon in other stuff in the future. But yeah, that's it. That's all I have to say about this episode. I had a lot to talk about, and oddly enough, this review is about as long as a single episode of Doctor Who at the time. So take that for what you will, and I will say goodbye to you now. So next time we're going to talk about a brand new Doctor, relatively speaking, and yeah, farewell William Hartnell, and may he rest in peace. Yeah, he was the first Doctor. He still, in my opinion, is the best of the classic series Doctors. No question about that. But yeah, thank you, Bill Hartnell. You are gravely missed, and still beloved to this day. Not much else I can say about that anymore. So thank you for watching. Let me know what you thought about this episode. Let me know what you thought about the William Hartnell era as a whole. And I suppose I'll see you later. Sometime. So, yeah, thank you for watching, and goodbye. Hi there. Thank you for watching the video. And if you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and tell your friends. I'll see you next time.